Hello, this is Graham. This is week 9 and we're drawing on chapter 7 in the course textbook, which is focused on coaching. As HR professionals, you'll be expected to coach people from time to time. You'll also be responsible for deciding who should receive coaching and who will give it to them. So let's have a look at coaching, how we define it, some of the differences between coaching and other interventions, and also a little bit of a look at some of the subtleties of what's involved in coaching. The CIPD say that there is no agreed definition of coaching in common use. That's certainly true. Back in 2013, I was asked by the coaching division of the BACP, which is the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy, to write a short review of the literature of coaching definitions, and I was invited to offer my own if there seemed to be scope to do so. Of course I did. If you're interested, then you can read the background review at the URL that I've shown here, which has got all the citations and the references to the people that I quoted or drew on to look at their definitions. So here's the one that I produced. Coaching is a generally future-oriented, strategic, developmental intervention that takes place in an evolving relationship of mutual confidence and uses a variety of tactics to enable its subjects to develop the resources within them to achieve improved performance and or personal satisfaction, with possible benefits to other stakeholders. As with any definition, a lot of those words have got some kind of implicit meaning, so let's go through a few of those. It is generally future-oriented. In other words, it doesn't seek to address past woes, it starts with what we have right now, and that's a big distinction from many therapeutic approaches. It's strategic. In other words, there is some kind of bigger picture. It's developmental. In other words, it assumes that growth happens in some direction and that it's unlikely to be reversed. In other words, people grow and get better. It's an intervention. This avoids implying that it's all about conversation between two people in real time, because there are lots of other ways in which those conversations can happen or exchanges can happen by email, online, not necessarily in real time, and so on. Lots of different options there. Similarly, it doesn't have to be between two people, which I'll pick up on in a moment. It's an evolving relationship. In other words, most coaching begins between two people who are strangers, and therefore the relationship evolves. Whereas in a counselling arrangement, the power balance between the counsellor and the client tends to remain quite fixed throughout the relationship. In a coaching one, my experience is that it is evolving and changing through time, and that needs to be acknowledged and worked with by the couple when they're working. Or the team. It revolves around mutual confidence. Whereas counselling and psychotherapy tend to assume confidentiality, this is not always the case with coaching. In fact, there are quite a lot of examples of coaching where there may be more than one person involved in the relationship, where there could be a team, or where the coaching is actually taking place in a very public domain. Obvious examples being the dance troupe who are working with a dance director, or a football team that are working with a variety of different coaches, and so on. In some coaching environments, there almost certainly will remain, in many coaching environments, there will almost certainly remain an imbalance between the power state of the coach and the coachee. In almost all of situations, the coach is in a lower power position, and particularly in executive coaching, than the executive that they're working with. Therefore, some terms that would be used in a counselling kind of arrangement probably wouldn't be appropriate or wouldn't be relevant in coaching. What I do think, though, is that for coaching to work, the coach must have some confidence in the potential of their client to benefit, and the client has to have some kind of confidence in the potential of the coach to help them. I use the word or phrase variety of tactics. Yes, most coaches use listening skills, but there are all sorts of other things that can be done with coaching. practical skills based, it can be technology related. Almost any of the tools that would be used in an adult learning environment can somehow be transferred across into the coaching relationship. It doesn't have to be purely based on conversation and on listening skills. I used the concept of subjects. This is because, first of all, I wanted to pick up on the fact that the coaching can happen with groups. But I was also concerned that some people don't resonate with the phrase coachee, nor do they resonate very well with the word client. And in an executive coaching environment, very often there will be a sponsor. You as HR professionals will almost certainly be sponsoring individuals for coaching. And in that situation, you become as much a part of the relationship as the person who is receiving the coaching. I'm not saying that confidentiality has to necessarily be breached, but what I am saying is that all three parties, the coach, the client that's receiving the work, and the sponsor, all need to be being managed and managing the relationships amongst the three of them. In my experience, things break down when the three aren't all engaged in the process. We can talk about that if we want to in the class. I talk about resources within. This is really to distinguish coaching from most other forms of teaching. I would argue that coaching is generally used where subjects have some kind of internal potential that's not necessarily being tapped into. It might encourage them to supplement their knowledge, but generally its focus is going to be on developing their ability to use whatever they already have by drawing on internal resources. It's going to be possibly about opening their eyes to the potential that they've got. It might be opening their eyes to the things that are preventing them from achieving that potential. But focus in coaching is almost always within the individual. I talk about improved performance and or personal satisfaction, and I deliberately specify those two separately because there are some coaching situations where you are going to be helping somebody work towards personal satisfaction. Life coaching would be an obvious example, rather than necessarily improved performance. But equally, there are situations where a coach can work with a client, an executive being a good example, where the person feels very satisfied personally about the kind of results that they've got. But that doesn't necessarily mean to say that the performance has been improved. So separate the two out when we're thinking about what we're looking for in coaching. I also mentioned benefits. I originally thought of these as being something that was in addition to the main subject, but the more I think about it, there are lots of situations where I can think of individuals may not feel that they've gained much personally, but another entity does. So the classic example would be the team coach, but there are also going to be situations in the world of work where an individual doesn't necessarily feel that they've got the best out of the process, but the organisation itself does. So there can be conflicts there between the different things, and indeed there may well be some situations where a client of a coach, the individual, might feel that their needs have actually been compromised in favour of the organisation's. It happens. And really just reinforcing this point I've mentioned about other stakeholders. It isn't always just the client, the coach and their sponsor. There may well be other stakeholders as well who benefit from the coaching arrangement. And understanding those wider benefits can be very important when you're putting in a cost-benefit analysis of coaching work or justification for investment in coaching, because very often the benefits can be much wider than simply to those two to the organisation and to the individual. So that's really my definition of coaching. It's a bit cumbersome, might be a bit cumbersome, but it's no worse than a lot of other coaching definitions, and I hope that I've tried to explain some of the subtleties in where I was coming from when I wrote it. The CIPD asks you to consider how you would go about selecting a coach. So let's have a look at what coaching actually involves, what we're trying to achieve, and make some suggestions as to how coaching needs to be looked at. First of all, let's ask, what does learning and development in general have an impact on? Well, it's three things. It's knowledge, skills, and attitudes. We know that. For a senior executive, which of those is likely to need developing? Simple answer, it's their attitudes. They've almost always got the knowledge that they need, they've got the skills that they need. It's something to do with them that's getting in the way of their delivery. And that's how we come to become involved as coaches. What are attitudes? Attitudes fundamentally are part of the mechanism that allows our ego to defend itself. It's part of our survival mechanism. If our attitudes get challenged, then our ego is less able to defend itself. If they're challenged gently, or if they're challenged subtly, then the ego won't be sufficiently demolished that it has a problem. But if they're not challenged effectively, then the ego compensates. And the way it compensates is that it leads to various mental health conditions, anxiety, ultimately depression, and a variety of other different disorders. But fundamentally, it's anxiety and depression that result. So the coach's job is to help reshape a senior executive's attitudes. So what qualities are you looking for in the coach to make that kind of difference? It constantly amazes me that HR professionals will allocate a senior player in their organisation to a coach, expecting them to work on their attitudes, which in some way are impacting on their performance at work, without any consideration of the coach's credentials to do so. The focus of the work isn't necessarily negative, but what it involves is dismantling or reinforcing coping strategies that that person uses in their day-to-day life. It doesn't matter whether you're dealing with somebody at the top of an organisation or somewhere else in the organisation. If we're concerned with enhancing performance, then there's a danger that we're going to be enhancing performance in one dimension and in the process affecting other aspects of their life as well. Those are the kinds of issues, those are the kinds of constraints that a psychotherapist would be constantly assessing. But it's generally not even on the radar of most coaches. So I would argue that one of the aspects that you do need to think of ways of selecting a coach or taking into consideration when selecting a coach excuse me, is just how aware they are of the vulnerability of people and of the way in which their work can impact on an individual outside their core activities. A while back, I pointed out to an HR director that he was only ever going to send one of his key players to a top surgeon on Harley Street if they were suffering from a physical ailment, even though that might not actually be performance limiting, and yet he was quite happy to send them to an executive coach who'd only completed a couple of weekends training and allow that coach to dabble in the psyche of the individual in order to search for some kind of step change in delivery. I think we just need to take that a little bit more seriously. We're going to explore the qualities that you might look for in a coach during the class, but do start giving it a little bit of thought. What would you be looking for if you were to try and link up a coach with one of your senior players? How will you make sure they're capable of doing the job? And the other area in which the CIPD would like you to put some thought is, how does the definition of coaching differ from that of counselling? Watson and Reisner suggest that it is hard to distinguish the two. I'm afraid I don't agree. Counselling is very different from coaching, and I've taken my definition and I've just tried to extract some of the words that make it clear that there is a difference. Counselling is not necessarily future orientated, nor is it strategic, nor is it necessarily developmental. It can be a simple holding mechanism for people. That's very different from coaching. While it is hoped that the client trusts the counsellor, it would be a very naive counsellor who would trust their client wholeheartedly. Clients have been kidding themselves for a long time that all is okay, and they have finally decided that it's time to work on something. That implies that they are very capable of lying to themselves, so why is there any reason why they shouldn't lie to their counsellor? Many counsellors have one core type of training. Indeed, there's a school of thought that those of us who describe ourselves as eclectic or integrative are misguided. In other words, we do not use a variety of tactics. We fundamentally have one process that we use, and we rarely deviate from it. In terms of achieving improved performance or personal satisfaction, the evidence is quite thin on the ground for the effectiveness of counselling generally. And besides, a lot of people are actually entering it not interested in outcomes or benefits. They are wanting somebody with whom they can explore things. They are not necessarily expecting to feel any better or any different as a result of it, though it is quite possible, of course, that they could do so. So a fundamental difference between coaching, which is generally results oriented, and counselling, which is not. Very important discrepancy. And finally, in coaching, I would argue that in most cases there is a third party involved, there are other stakeholders, whereas in counselling, in the majority of cases, there will be people who are collateral, if you like, to the individual, but there are not really other stakeholders who've got a vested interest in the outcomes of the counselling. Watson and Reiser also suggest that it's hard to distinguish between coaching and mentoring. Now, I accept that it's harder, but I would say that because they are both pretty imprecise terms, but I'd expect anyone who is defining one of them, coaching for example, to be able to say how they distinguish it from the other. There will be some mentors who adopt a coaching approach. Though the majority that I've encountered don't tend to use the same processes, they use things that are very different. But the fundamental in here is that if it's important to have a distinction between the two, it should be perfectly easy to do so once you've defined coaching to be able to separate that from mentoring. Okay, that's my rant for the week, and I look forward to the class, seeing you there, and we're going to have some interesting times working on the coaching process. Okay, see you then. Bye.